Welcome to members of the Spokane community who are here. Let me welcome you to the Gonzaga campus. I'm David Calhoun, director of the Gonzaga Faith and Reason Institute. The Institute organizes public activities that promote an integrationist understanding of faith and reason, particularly as those are articulated in the Catholic intellectual tradition and found in issues such as faith and science, philosophical theology, reflection on evil and suffering, and the cultural and social impact of Christianity. The Institute is financially supported by the Father Robert J. Spitzer Society of Jesus Leadership Fund, which was created when Father Spitzer retired from serving as Gonzaga president, and which has been supported by a crowd of thankful admirers of Father Spitzer. The Institute is grateful to all those who have supported the Institute financially, thereby making events like tonight's talk possible. So thanks to those folks. The Institute has had on a number of occasions, organized events featuring the thought of Christian author and apologist C.S. Lewis. While Lewis died over 60 years ago, new audiences delight to his fiction and are challenged by the rigorous logic and human richness of his philosophical works, his essays, and his sermons. Lewis was deeply committed to the integration of faith and reason, which makes his thought an excellent subject for the Institute. Lewis's commitment on this score was particularly or practically embodied in his willingness to serve for a number of years as president of the Oxford Socratic Club, which explored religious themes from a broadly philosophical point of view. The Oxford Socratic Club is the namesake and model for the Gonzaga Socratic Club, the co-organizer or co-sponsor of tonight's talk. Our speaker is Robert K. Garcia. Robert Garcia is Associate Professor of Philosophy at Baylor University. His research lies primarily at the intersection of metaphysics and philosophy of religion, with particular focus on the nature and value of human persons. He has authored numerous articles and book chapters and co-edited several volumes, including a recently co-authored book on the popular series about the life of Jesus, The Chosen. He has taught courses on C.S. Lewis for a number of years now and is working on a book on Lewis and Soren Kierkegaard. His research and teaching particularly prepare him to address the subject of his talk tonight, which explores C.S. Lewis's view of the inherent value of the human person as created in the image of God. Please welcome Robert Garcia for his talk, The Beautiful Truth About Yourself, C.S. Lewis on the Imago Day.
Thank you. Thank you, David, for inviting me to come, and thank you as well for coming to my talk. I wish to thank the Faith and Reason Institute in particular for supporting this endeavor for me. I'm going to set my timer here so I know when to shut up. Let's see. Okay. So, C.S. Lewis was once given the job of hosting I.A. Richards, who was visiting Oxford to give a lecture. Richards was the leading defender of a type of literary criticism that Lewis staunchly disagreed with. When Lewis noticed that his guest had no reading material for the evening, he said, "Hold on, I'll be right back." When Lewis returned, he was holding a copy of Richards' own book called Principles of Literary Criticism. You can tell where this story is going, I think. He handed it to Richards and said, "Here, this should put you to sleep." Later that evening, Richards was not amused to discover that the margins of the book were full of Lewis's scathing criticisms. So on that fateful evening, Lewis handed Richards his own book to reconsider. This evening, I'm going to ask you to take a closer look at an idea, one which I presume you already hold. The idea that each person has irreplaceable and supreme value. Let's hope I can do this without putting you to sleep. Okay. So let me start with a question about Lewis's books. So what do you think Lewis's largest body of work is? Right. Fiction, nonfiction, something else? Just to give you something to work with, here are lists. I know this is hard to read. You don't need to read it. I'll just tell you. So on the left is the list of his fiction and poetry, 22 books. On the right, his nonfiction, 36 books, right? And there are different ways to count these because some of the essays show up more than once. But on the whole, he wrote a lot, right? About 58 books or so in total. So he was obviously extremely prolific. So you might think that the largest body of work by Lewis is his books. But that's actually not the case. His largest body of work is his correspondence. The letters that he wrote to individuals. As I will show you, there's more output in his correspondence than in the books that he wrote, and he wrote almost 60 books. So in one of his letters, he said this to his friend Dom B.B. Griffiths. He says, "It isn't chiefly men I am kept in touch with by my huge mail. It is women. The female, happy or unhappy, agreeing or disagreeing, is by nature a much more epistolary animal than the male." I don't know whether Lewis was right about that generalization, but something that's true is that Lewis himself was a counterexample to this generalization. If anybody was an epistolary animal, it was Lewis. And so I like to call the next main part of my talk Lewis the epistolary animal. So here's a little map for my talk just so we can know what's happening. The first thing I want to do is talk about this interesting fact about Lewis, his correspondence. I'm going to tell you some things about that. And what I hope to do is get you to agree there's something remarkable, shocking about it, something that sort of cries out for an explanation. And I think there is an explanation, a deeper one, that I'll point to, and this little acronym VIP stands for that. And I'll just tell you, VIP stands for each person is irreplaceably and supremely valuable. So VIP stands for the idea that every person is very important in this maximal sense. In part two, I'm going to take a closer look at VIP, asking the question, what does it take for that to be true about us? And then I'm going to look at Lewis's own view about human persons, what I call the resonator theory. I'll explain that. And then we'll finish by looking at an episode in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, having to do with the lion. So that's where we're going. So let's start with Lewis, the epistolary animal. So I'm just going to tell you a few facts and show you some things that I find interesting. Hopefully you will too. So Lewis started young writing letters. 7-year-old Lewis, that's the first letter that we have in the collected letters. 1905, he says this, "I'm doing French as well as Latin." 7 years old. "And I think I like the Latin better. Tomorrow I decline that old bonus, bona, bonum thing." The last letter we have was written the day before he died, 1963. He says, "It's a funny thing that all the children who have written to me see at once who Aslan was, and grown-ups never do." So Lewis wrote to all kinds of people, obviously friends and family and his students and other scholars, but also to children and to strangers. So let me just show you a few snapshots from his correspondence that are particularly interesting. So there's a whole book of the letters that he wrote to this American woman, 141 letters that he wrote to her over 13 years. And if you read this, you just see the heart of Lewis being poured out to this woman, letter after letter, helping her, encouraging her, and so on. He also supported her financially, like he did with many people that he corresponded with and discovered they had needs. So if you look at Lewis's correspondence, you can find books of subsets of those letters like this one. Another example of this is the book Letters to Children. So a whole collection of the letters that Lewis wrote to children. You can find that, and in fact, he liked to doodle and draw in his letters. So you see there a drawing of an elephant and a cat and so on. Another snapshot has to do with this Italian fellow, Don Giovanni Calabria, an Italian priest, didn't speak or write English, so like you do when you're an Italian priest, you write in Latin. So he wrote Lewis in Latin, which had to delight Lewis, and Lewis wrote him back in Latin. And so they have a correspondence for about 7 years in Latin, back and forth. Thankfully, it's been translated in the collected letters, so you can read it. And that too has been published in a separate little book of Lewis's letters to this guy. So in terms of quantity and scope of this, so the collected letters, there are 3 volumes, and they're massive, 1,200 pages to 1,700 pages each, kind of small print. And altogether we have 3,226 letters in the collected letters. And one thing that's interesting about Lewis's life is you would think he lived through the First World War, he was a wounded veteran of that war, and he lived through the Second World War. And during the Second World War, his productivity spiked. So his total output, people have talked about this, he's incredibly productive during the Second World War. And it wasn't like he was hiding out in his ivory tower. He was spending the weekends giving talks to the Royal Air Force and doing nighttime duty in Oxford. I mean, he was incredibly busy, and yet he wrote all these books and gave the BBC broadcasts that ultimately became Mere Christianity in this time as well. So it also had the effect of making Lewis popular. So his popularity just surged during this time, and so did his correspondence. So around 1940 and thereafter, he started getting a lot of mail. So let me give you just some excerpts from his letters where he talks about this. So in 1947, to his best friend Arthur Greaves, he says, "The daily letter writing without Warney, his brother, to help me is appalling. An hour and a half or 2 hours every morning before I can get to my own work." 1947, he's not even at the peak of his popularity yet. 1960, 3 years before he dies, to Vera Gebert. "Yes, mea culpa, I'm a poor correspondent. That is to say, the ghastly daily grind of unavoidable letters leaves me a brain and a hand very ill-disposed to pleasanter and friendlier correspondence. For example, it's now 9:50 a.m., and I've already been writing letters as hard as I can drive the pen across the paper for an hour and a half. And when on earth I shall get a chance to begin my own day's work, I don't know." So the other letter mentioned his brother Warney. Warney started helping Lewis. This is a picture of his brother Warney. He retired from the Army in 1941, and this is a picture of Warney's typewriter. So Warney started helping Lewis with the correspondence, but Warney was a 2-finger typist. Right? So he helped him in this 2-finger kind of way, on and off, for the rest of Lewis's life. And after Lewis died, in Warney's diary, he records the estimation that he thinks he helped Lewis write about 12,000 letters on that typewriter. He was lamenting that his typewriter finally broke, and he's like, this thing wrote 12,000 letters for my brother. Right? 12,000 letters that Warney wrote for Lewis. So Lyle Dorset, who's written about Lewis, he says this: "By the 1950s, it was common for Lewis to receive between 200 and 250 letters a week. He answered most of them by hand, and he had arthritis in his hand. And he did this for nearly 25 years. So Walter Hooper, the man who collected the letters, he says this: "One of the first things I noticed was the immensely heavy burden of letter writing that Lewis shouldered almost every morning. After breakfast, we spent about 2 hours replying to every letter he received." Okay, so 3,226 collected letters, But of course, those are only the collected ones. So a fun question to ask is, how many total letters did he write? Well, if you go on eBay, like I do once in a while, do a search on C.S. Lewis, sort it by the highest price first. Sometimes you'll find letters that people have discovered in a drawer or in the attic or something, and they usually sell them for thousands of dollars. So there are lots of letters that are still being discovered, and I've even helped discover some of them. And there's a lot more out there, right, than the 3,226. So you'll have to indulge me for a moment, and it may be hard to see, but I've tried to estimate, like in a conservative to moderate range, how many letters Lewis actually wrote. So I'm going to give you a couple of ballparks, and I'm going to show you my math, just so you'll believe the results. Okay, so the first one is a conservative estimate, and this is only from 1940 to 1963, just 23 years, and that amounts to 1,196 weeks. And my first way of estimating it, suppose he wrote only 5 days a week, right? And that he wrote for an hour and a half on each of those days, and that his writing speed was 2 letters per hour. So very conservative, right? At that estimation, we get 18,000 letters total. A little more generous estimates. Suppose he wrote 6 days a week, which we know he often did, instead of 5, and then he wrote a little bit faster, 2.5 letters per hour, and you get almost 27,000 letters total. So altogether, 18 to 27,000 letters, which is corroborated by Warney's estimate of 12,000. So if Warney wrote 12, then Lewis is certainly going to write at least that much more, right? So I think this is a pretty accurate estimation. That is a lot of letters. So hopefully you're starting to think, or ask yourself the question that I want to raise now, like, what was the opportunity cost, right? Lewis has written these books that have changed people's lives. The Narnia Chronicles, the Screwtape Letters, and so on. How many more Narnia Chronicles could Lewis have written instead of writing all these letters to individuals, strangers, right, that he writes to? So again, I'm going to show you a bit of an estimation. Lewis, fast, efficient writer, could have spent his time writing books for the public instead of these letters. So what does this amount to in terms of, if you take the numbers I've shown you, like what does that amount to in numbers of books that he could have written? So indulge me for a moment here. So there are the two numbers I showed you before. Conservatively, 18,000 to 27,000 total letters. We know, it's been calculated that the average length of a letter during this time is 1.3 book pages in length. Right. Just trust me on that. So you get this in terms of total book pages. Lewis's books average about 250 pages per book. So we get these mind-boggling numbers, right? In terms of the unwritten books that he could have written instead, if he just transfer it over, 94 to 140 books, right? Now, of course, a lot of those letters he had to write to friends, to students, to publishers, but many of them he did not have to write. He always encouraged his correspondents to write me back, tell me what you think, right? So this was not something that Lewis had to do. So at any rate, the opportunity cost for Lewis is pretty staggering, especially if you consider the impact that his books have had, right? Okay, so this comes to the question of why Lewis did this. Oh, I have one more quote for you. So Walter Hooper says this, just to finish this little section. When one considers what a large part of the letters are replies to those who wrote him about his books, it must seem that Lewis spent more time replying to their letters than writing the books themselves. Indeed, that's certainly the case. Okay, so why did Lewis do this? So one thing we can say about why Lewis did this is why he didn't, right? So he did not assume that his letters were going to be published. He thought his books were going to be out of print within 3 years of his death. He told Walter Hooper this. He also wouldn't want his letters to be published. And Clyde Kilby says in his biography, or his work on Lewis, that Lewis had no idea that his letters would ever be published. So he didn't write these letters thinking, well, someday my letters will be published because I'm so famous, and none of that, right? That was not the reason. So I'll give you two initial explanations that I think are accurate but don't go to the heart of the matter. So the first one is that Lewis had a sense of duty. He writes about having a duty to the public, that when I write books, I have a duty to respond to people who ask me about them. He says this over and over in his letters. So he definitely wrote out of his sense of duty. Another more interesting feature of Lewis's conviction here is that he was following medieval models. So Lewis was a medievalist, a scholar of the Middle Ages, and if you look at many of the most famous books in the Middle Ages, especially in terms of Christian spirituality, many of them originally were written for a single person. So, such as The Cloud of Unknowing, The Scale of Perfection, and Brother Lawrence's The Practices of the Presence of God. Each of those originally was written for one person, and later was like, hey, we should put this out in the public, right? One of Lewis's pen pals, Evelyn Underhill, who was a scholar of the mystics and the Middle Ages, she wrote about Walter Hilton, and she says this: Hilton thought it worthwhile to write a whole book for the purpose of educating one special soul. Lewis loved Walter Hilton. He knew about this, and so I think he was probably inspired by this medieval model. So, two explanations there: sense of duty, following this medieval model. But of course, this just raises the question of, well, why did he think he had this duty? Why follow them? Why think that it's worth it to invest in a special soul in this kind of way? And I think this leads us to the deeper explanation, which I've already alluded to, that Lewis believed, and these are my words, that each person is both supremely valuable and unique and irreplaceable. So let me give you two quick passages where he sort of expresses this idea, and then we're going to look at this idea in some detail. So in his essay, Christianity and Literature, he says this: the salvation of a single soul is more important than the production or preservation of all the epics and tragedies in the world. So says the man who loved the epics and tragedies of the world probably more than anybody else, right? And then the most well-known passage where he talks about this is in his famous sermon, The Weight of Glory, where he says, it is a serious thing to live in a society of possible gods and goddesses. There are no ordinary people. So the previous quote has to do with the value of persons. This has to do with the uniqueness of persons. So I'll show you more quotes in a few minutes, but you get the sense. Lewis was definitely committed to this idea, which I'm calling VIP. Each person is irreplaceably and supremely valuable. Okay, so I want to take a closer look at this claim. So we're going to step away from Lewis for a few minutes and into the kind of more metaphysical, philosophical world to look at this idea, what it takes for it to be true, and what it means, and so on. Okay, so here's what I want to say about VIP. I want to say that it's familiar, it's popular, it's momentous, and it's vexed. So by familiar, what I mean is I think you probably have heard of this idea before. You're probably deeply sympathetic to it. We've heard of this idea. It's also extremely popular, even in secular contexts. So if you do a quick Google search on "you are unique," "you are special," "you are irreplaceable," you'll be treated to all these images and bumper stickers and slogans and so on. So it operates in our culture at the level of a platitude or a slogan, right? We've all heard of this. We all kind of buy into it in the West. So it's popular. And it's also popular in religious contexts. I could give you lots of quotes from all the famous Christian authors of today and in the past who in various ways talk about this. But my favorite is so I teach at Baylor University, and like most universities, you have faculty training that you have to do, or you're supposed to do, and you get around to doing it once in a while. And I finally did some faculty training in the spring, and lo and behold, I come across this teaching about inclusivity, and here's the quote: "Inclusive excellence begins with recognizing the divine uniqueness in each person," right? No explanation what that means or why we should think it's true, just laying it into the faculty training, like we all know what it means, we all know why we should think it's true, and so on. So it's just commonly held. It's also momentous in the sense that it's either the height of wishful thinking, the highest conceit, the highest way to flatter ourselves as human beings, or it's the most important fact when it comes to ethics and the value of human beings. We can see this because something similar is encoded in the UN Declaration of Human Rights, which says, quote, "The recognition of the inherent dignity and of the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family is the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world." That's not the same thing exactly as VIP, but it's very close to it. So VIP is also vexed. And let me say what I mean by that. So John Crosby has this phrase that he calls depersonalizing forces. These are ideologies and tendencies that tend to degrade and pulverize human beings. So we have two ways in which VIP is vexed. One, we live in a world in which we're constantly given messages and ideas that undercut it. Right? Just think of all the systemic problems that make people feel like they're not valuable, that they're not worthwhile, or that they're nothing, right? You can point to all sorts of things, and I could give you a long list. Another way that it's vexed is it's just unclear what it means, right? And so when we kind of buy into an idea, we're not sure what it means, it doesn't have a big grip on us. And it's easily overthrown and pushed aside by ideas that have a deeper root in our understanding. Okay, so there's an urgency here. Why think it's true? In other words, why should we think that persons have supreme and irreplaceable value? And to put it in terms of sort of a metaphysical question, what do persons have to be like? What does the world have to be like for this to be the case, right? Okay, so this actually brings us to the sort of the pivot point in my talk. And so if you've fallen behind, I understand. Take a moment. I'm going to get a sip of water here, because now I'm going to move on to part two, and so you can catch up on your thinking here. So far, the idea is Lewis was committed to this correspondence at a great cost to himself. Why did he do that? I think it's because he valued individuals in this incredibly profound way that led him to think it's worth all the time. Like, I'm not just a maximizer of public-facing utility or something like that. Underlying that conviction, underlying his practice seems to be his conviction, a view about persons. So he was living out in a practical way, at a great cost to himself, his view about persons. Okay, so now let's look at what it takes for this view to be true. And we'll look at that for a few minutes. We'll come back to Lewis and see how he provides a foundation for it. Okay, so we're moving on to the requirements for VIP. So the next few minutes are sort of the most technical part of my talk. So slap yourself, throw some water on your face, nudge your neighbor, or don't worry about it. Like, it's okay. Like, you can jump back on in a moment. But okay, so a bit of terminology. So let's use this phrase, unique maker, just to refer to something that makes you unique, right? So here's a list of sort of standard unique makers. Your fingerprints, right? Being the tallest person, if you happen to be that. Being the inventor of Post-its. Your social relationships, like that makes you're the only one that has this specific configuration of relationships. Your set of total experiences, right? And your history, your sort of path through space and time, right? Or just the fact that you're right at that spot right now. That makes you unique. So unique makers, easy to come by, right? There are properties of things that make things unique. So what we want to ask is, what kind of unique maker do you have to have for VIP to be true, right? What kind of unique maker do you need to be irreplaceably and supremely valuable? Sort of spoiler alert, none of the ones we just looked at are going to do the job. So here's what it takes, and this is the details. So I think that for a unique maker to do the job, your uniqueness has to be three things. Supremely valuable, that's pretty obvious. But the other two terms are a little more technical. It has to be essential to you and global. And I'll tell you what that means. So the first one is supremely valuable. So according to VIP, you are more than just irreplaceable. You're more than just irreplaceable, and you're more than just supremely valuable. Rather, your supreme value is irreplaceable. You have an irreplaceable value. And your uniqueness is itself supremely valuable. So VIP requires a unique maker that makes you not only unique, but also supremely valuable. So you need something about you that doesn't just make you unique, but it also has to ground your being valuable in this maximal kind of way. Okay. Essential. This essentiality in philosopher speak means something that you can't exist without. It doesn't just mean important, like we often use it to mean in contemporary speech. So if something is essential to you, it's part of your nature, you can't exist without it. So then to be essentially unique is to have a unique maker that's part of your essence, part of your nature. You can't exist without it. It can't be something like, well, you're sitting in this chair right now because you could have existed and not sat in that chair right now. Sorry, I'm pointing right at you. You're right there. Okay, so VIP requires a unique maker that makes you irreplaceably and supremely valuable. So your value is supreme then only if you can't exist without it, right? VIP isn't simply saying you happen to now be supremely valuable. It's saying you are in your nature supremely valuable. So it's part of your essence. So we need a unique maker that makes you unique and supremely valuable, and it's got to be part of your essence, not something you acquire, not a function of some contingent fact about you. Okay, I just said that. So the last one is global. This is probably the most controversial, actually. So, and this is a metaphysical term. So global means it's impossible for anyone else to have it. So if you're globally unique, then you have something not had by any other actual or possible person, right? So according to VIP then, let me back up for a second. So what this means is if I'm globally unique, I'm not just unique in this actual world, but rather there's no other possible world in which somebody else has the unique maker that I have, right? So it's impossible in the strongest sense of impossibility, right? Okay, according to VIP, your value is irreplaceable. Your value is irreplaceable only if it's not possible for somebody else to have the value you have. So if you are really irreplaceable, hear this, if you're irreplaceable in this sense, then it's not even possible for God to duplicate you, right? God can't say, Nate, done a bad job, you're out of here, I'm making a new Nate. Nope, even if you're irreplaceable in this sense, sorry Nate, God doesn't have the power to do that. And yes, even the omnipotent God does not have the power to do that on this view. We can talk about that. Okay, but I'm trying to emphasize how strong a claim this is. Okay, so VIP requires your value to be globally unique. Okay, so if we go back to this list of popular unique makers, hopefully it's clear that none of them satisfied the demands. Maybe your history is essential to you, some aspect of your origin maybe is essential to you, but it's not essential to you to have any of the other features. And certainly your fingerprints, just to pick one example, maybe they're unique to you in this world, although that's actually probably not the case. They certainly don't make you supremely valuable, right? Your relationships, no doubt they make you valuable, but they probably don't make you supremely valuable. Okay. So it looks like the popular unique makers aren't going to do the job. So what I want to suggest is that Lewis has a unique maker that he is proposing that does do the job. Right? It does all these things. So this brings us back to Lewis, you'll be glad to know, out of the sort of deep into the pool of metaphysics back to the world of Lewis. And now I'll show you a bunch of quotes that you'll enjoy and things like that. Okay, so let's look at Lewis's view about the uniqueness of persons, what I call resonator theory. And I'm just going to give it to you. These are my words summarizing what I find in Lewis across his work. So hopefully he would agree with this summary. Here it is. Each person has an essential capacity to image God in a specific way, and no other creature could have the capacity to image God in that way. So notice immediately this is a view about what it means to be created in the image of God, right? Each person is a unique image of God. Or to use language I want to use here, you have the capacity to image God in a way that no other person can. So, it's impossible for anyone else, past or future, to image God as you can. So, by image here, I just want to play a little fast and loose, generally speaking. It means lots of things: to know God, to enjoy God, to glorify God, to praise God, to mediate God, or to reveal something about God. All of these things we can include in what this means. That's not something I'm going to spend a lot of time on. Why do I call this a resonator theory? Well, the main reason is I came up with it years ago and it's just kind of stuck, right? But it also fits with Lewis. So here's a quote from one of his essays. He says, "Divine reality is like a fugue. All of his acts are different, but they all rhyme or echo to one another." So a fugue is a musical piece where you have a central pattern, and then in the piece you hear reiterations of that pattern in slightly different ways, right? So the idea here is that when God creates, there's like a central pattern, and that's God himself, and that each creature is a different reiteration of that pattern, but each reiteration is slightly different. And all together, those reiterations create this beautiful, symphonic, holistic, beautiful thing. Okay. So the basis for VIP is what we're going to look at next. And then I'll give you some of the details and then some of the rationales for it. So by basis, I mean, what is it about Lewis's resonator theory that satisfies those conditions that I gave you for VIP? Okay, so notice, here are the three conditions: essential, global, and supremely valuable. The first two, I think, are pretty explicit in the passages I'm going to show you, and I think the notion of supreme value is just clearly implied. So I'm going to focus on the first two. And I'm now going to just read you several passages from Lewis. This will take a few minutes. The first one is from the Screwtape Letters. That one's short, and then a passage from his anthology of George MacDonald, and then the last one is from The Problem of Pain. So, Screwtape Letters, one demon writing to another demon, trying to train that demon how to sabotage the soul of this dude called the patient. So this is the truth written upside down for Lewis, right? And so here's what Screwtape says: "Remember always that he, God, really likes the little vermin and sets an absurd value on the distinctness of every one of them," right? So this is the devil sort of telling the other devil something about the enemy who's God, right? Absurd value, right? Okay, George MacDonald. So Lewis said that George MacDonald was one of the biggest influences on his thought. And he created an anthology of George MacDonald as well. And so the passage in front of you is from this anthology, which we can be rest assured that Lewis agreed with. And here's what MacDonald said: "Each man is to God a peculiar being." Peculiar here means unique. "Made after his own fashion and that of no one else. Hence he can worship God as no man else can worship him." MacDonald is saying that each person has the capacity to worship God in a way that nobody else can worship God. Here's how Lewis puts it in The Problem of Pain. He says, each of the redeemed shall forever know and praise some one aspect of the divine beauty better than any other creature can. So you have the power to reflect, reveal, image an aspect of the divine beauty that nobody else can reflect or share. Final passage here that I'm going to read you. This is from The Problem of Pain. It's a long one, but I think you'll agree it's worth it. So here's what he says. Be sure that the ins and outs of your individuality are no mystery to God, and one day they will no longer be a mystery to you. The mold in which a key is made would be a strange thing if you had never seen a key, and the key itself a strange thing if you had never seen a lock. Your soul has a curious shape because it is a hollow made to fit a particular swelling in the infinite contours of the divine substance, or a key to unlock one of the doors in the house with many mansions. For it is not humanity in the abstract that is to be saved, but you, the individual reader, John Stubbs or Janet Smith. Your place in heaven will seem to be made for you and you alone, because you were made for it stitch by stitch as a glove is made for a hand. This passage is full of metaphors, and they all have to do with the unique fit between the nature of God and the nature of a human being, of a particular human being. There's, you are a hand in a glove, fit. You are fit for a certain aspect of the divine nature. Okay. Let me give you some details here. Let me check. Okay, time. I think I'm all right. This is the part where I could go fast, but I think I can do this. So this is just beyond showing how Lewis's resonator theory supports VIP. These are just extra details that I think you'll find interesting and maybe answer some questions that you might have. So the first thing to say is that your uniqueness is not total, right? We share a human nature, but the shared nature that we have doesn't exhaust your nature. So you can think of yourself as having a dual nature. Part of it is the one that we all have. The other part of it is the one that only you can have, right? So he says in this essay, Membership, each person is almost a species in himself. And that's what he seems to have in mind. So uniqueness is partial. Uniqueness is also what I call intensive. Let me see if I can explain this. So this is a passage from the beginning of the book, The Great Divorce. Listen to what he says. He says, life is not like a river, but like a tree. It does not move towards unity, but away from it. And the creatures grow further apart as they increase in perfection. Good, as it ripens, becomes continually more different, not only from evil, but from other good. I like to think of this as each person is a seed, right? Think of the kinds of seeds you would buy at the Home Depot for flowers. But on this view, there's only one seed for every possible kind of flower. If you look in your hand, you have a bunch of seeds. They're all for different flowers. At that seed stage, they're fairly similar looking, right? Some differences. But when you plant them and they grow, as they ripen, as Lewis says, they become increasingly different from each other, right? That's Lewis's view of persons, that you're unique in your nature, but you're meant to become increasingly unique as you mature and as you become more and more like God in the way that only you can become like God, right? So we grow in this diversity in this kind of way. Third, your uniqueness is holistic. This is the idea that every person has a place in the whole sort of, either in the body of Christ, how he talks about it in some places, or just a place in the spectrum of God's display of himself, right? Here's a quote, and he has lots of images for this. The dance in Paralandra, symphonies, fugues, tapestries, and so on. He says this, the whole dance or drama or pattern of this three-personal life is to be played out in each one of us. Or putting it the other way around, each one of us has got to enter that pattern, take his place in that dance. There's no other way to the happiness for which we were made. Okay, fourth, uniqueness is vocational. So because you have this unique capacity to image God in the way that nobody else can, this comes with a responsibility to do so. You can actualize goods that nobody else can actualize. So this uniqueness that you've been given is not something that's meant to be kept to yourself. Lewis has this interesting passage in the chapter Hell, actually the Heaven chapter. I forget. Heaven or Hell, Problem of Pain. He basically says something like this. It's in Heaven chapter. If somebody's in heaven and they point to something and they say, "This is mine," the trapdoor opens, you go straight to hell. There's no ownership, he says, in heaven. Yet, on the next page, he says that each person is unique, right? So there's a sense in which you own something, your uniqueness, right? The problem, though, the thing that opens the trap door, is like, your uniqueness is not something that's meant to be kept to yourself. It's something that you yourself can only enjoy when you share it, right? Lastly, uniqueness is compounding. So that you and I together, as we image God, and as I image God in the way only I can, and you do the same, we put on display something together that can't be displayed otherwise, right? Think of the way that a symphony, like you have something that's greater than the sum of the parts, right? Okay. Let me say a couple of things about the rationale. So this is the question of, hey, this sounds great, but why I think it's true, right? I like this idea, but what can be said sort of in a positive way in its favor? So I want to start by making a general comment about this, and then I'll point to two specific rationales. And I think the general comment for Lewis is probably the most important one. And it comes from a friend of his, Austin Ferrer, who said this, and he's talking about the way that Lewis does apologetics here. He says, "We think we're listening to an argument. In fact, we're presented with a vision, and it's the vision that carries conviction." So you might be having this experience now if you've paid attention, because often when I tell people about Lewis's view, the response is something like this: "I love this idea. That just has to be right. I've given no arguments for it," and the response is often, "Yeah, that's got to be true." This is the idea of the vision carrying conviction, right? So I think for Lewis, that's a big part of it, because he doesn't give much by way of direct arguments. What I'll show you are two offhand comments that he makes, where he's sort of alluding to a kind of philosophical rationale for it, but you have to reconstruct it, and I'll show you my attempt to do so. Okay, so two. The first one is from what we call the principle of sufficient reason. So here's something he says in The Problem of Pain. He says, if God had no use for all these differences between individuals, I do not see why he should have created more souls than one. Why else were individuals created, but that God, loving all infinitely, should love each differently? I kind of get it, right? Here's my way of unpacking it. Because I'm like, okay, I want to put this into argument form, like we do in philosophy. Here's the argument I think he's giving here. Hopefully he would agree. So here's the argument. God's reason for creating individuals is to love all of them infinitely, but each of them differently. Thus, God could have no reason to create two duplicate souls. God could create duplicate souls only if he had a reason to do so, so God can't create duplicate souls. Okay, maybe that's his argument. That's my way of reconstructing the quote I've given you. Okay, you can always push back on these arguments. The first and third premises are ones that you might challenge. Moving on, though, here's the other argument that I find in Lewis. I call it from the argument from the principle of plenitude. So here's a quote from Letters to Malcolm. He says, "And how should the infinite repeat himself? All space and time are too little for him to utter himself in them once." Another quote from Out of the Silent Planet, "Never did he make two things the same. Never did he utter one word twice." And from Paralandra, "Maleldil never repeated himself." The idea seems to be something like, God never makes anything more than once. And why? Well, he would never need to. He's got an infinitely rich set of ideas. If he's looking for ways to reveal himself, his nature, his beauty, his goodness is infinite. He never runs out of different ways to represent himself in the world. So the argument then would go like this: God's nature is infinitely rich, so there are an infinite number of ways to image God. So two implications that support the resonator theory. The first, it's never then necessary for God to create two persons that image him in exactly the same way. And by creating each person as a unique image, God's nature is more fully revealed. So he doesn't need to, and he'd always have a reason not to. Okay. I know that was a bit in the weeds there. Let's step back out and finish. How are we doing here? Okay. Let me get a drink. So, what have we done? Lewis, amazing commitment to writing letters. Why? It seems like at the heart of that commitment is living out this conviction that persons have this incredibly high value, right? And then he has a theory, it seems, about human persons that actually does it some justice. One that I think is attractive and that we should seriously consider. But here I have a confession to make. I'll tell you the confession after I give you this question. The question is, this is a pretty lofty view. It's an extremely high view of the value and significance of each person, right? Do you believe it? The confession is, I'm not sure I do, right? So, on one hand, intellectually, I think it's true, right? But there's more than one way to kind of believe something, right? So intellectually, I think it's true, but when it comes to the way I live, the way I feel about myself, it's not clear that I actually believe it. If I did really believe it, would I struggle with my self-image, sense of self-worth? If I really believe this incredibly high view of who I am, right? You would think that I would feel better about myself, right? But I'm not saying I need medical help or anything like that. I'm just saying like I'm the average person up here who struggles with self-doubt, self-image, self-worth, and so on, like most of us do. And yet I'm currently making a living at defending the truth of this view. That's why I'm here literally doing that right now, and yet in my heart, okay, all right, you get the confession. Okay, so how do we move then to a kind of wholehearted acceptance? Well, reason, philosophical arguments are not enough, right? Arguments only take you so far, right? I think what we need, in addition to arguments, is to use the imagination, right? Stories, for example. We need more than just a sort of rational grasp of the truth of something. We need to enter into it with our imagination in a way that can sort of take hold of us, right? So Lewis talks about this in several places. He is convinced, he has this whole essay called, sometimes a fairy story says best what needs to be said. That's the title of the essay, and of course the thesis of the essay. And the whole point in that essay is that, we have inhibitions, right? So he says here that he, quote, it's hard to feel as one was told one ought to feel about God or about the sufferings of Christ. In the same place, he argues that stories have a unique power to, quote, steal past those watchful dragons. It's a famous phrase. The watchful dragons, right? They're your kind of default intellectual settings that sort of put you on the defensive when you hear a new idea, right? His idea that stories kind of sneak past those watchful dragons, get a grip on you, and you're able to kind of get downwind of your own intellectual convictions to see that they might need to be revised, right? Okay, so let's look at a story that I think helps, right? Just one little story, but I think it shows something about Lewis's view about persons, and it's just one of my favorites. Okay, so Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Most of you probably have read this book. You've all probably heard of it. Who's the lion? Aslan, right? Did you know there's more than one lion in the story? There's 2 lions in this book. And the sad old second lion is just never talked about. And yet he's my favorite character in all the Narnia Chronicles, and he's never given a name. Okay, so the lion, the other unnamed lion that I'm going to tell you about, I think beautifully illustrates Lewis's resonator theory. Okay, chapter 9, Edmund has deserted his friends. He's headed to the witch's house. He shows up in her courtyard, and what happens? He sees a lion. At first he thinks it's a real living lion, and it turns out it's a statue of a lion. He kind of thinks maybe it's Aslan who's been made into a statue, and he defaces it. He puts a mustache on it, draws spectacles on it, right? But it's not very satisfying, actually, for Edmund when he does this. So that's the first time we meet this unnamed lion. It's a statue. And we know it used to be a living lion because all these statues in her courtyard used to be alive. Okay, that's chapter 9. Chapter 16, Aslan has risen from the dead, and he restores the lion. He goes to that courtyard, and the first statue he breathes on is this lion. And the lion yawns, stretches, bounds after Aslan, licking his face in delight. And then Aslan organizes the army. Right? They're going to war. And he says, this is Aslan speaking, those who are good with their noses must come in the front with us lions. The unnamed lion, hearing this, is overjoyed. This is what he says. Did you hear what he said? Us lions. That means him and me. Us lions. That's what I like about Aslan. No standoffishness. Us lions. That meant him and me. He keeps saying this until Aslan loads him up with 3 dwarves, 1 dryad, 2 rabbits, and a hedgehog. And that steadied him a bit. That's a quote, by the way. Okay. This lion is an image of Aslan. Clearly an image of Aslan. And notice, he's paired up with Aslan in a unique way. Us lions. So this unnamed lion is delighted to discover that there's a unique pairing between him and Aslan. Right? It delights him. And you'll see in the story, he just starts acting more and more like Aslan. He sort of becomes more and more like Aslan as they go along. Not perfectly, but he does. Okay, so, I just said all that. All right. Okay, so this story, like other stories, I think can help us. It's more an example of how a story might help us take to heart this vision of ourselves. We need more stories like this as well. So how then do we move from towards wholehearted acceptance? Reason, not enough. We need the imagination to be engaged in this kind of way. But I also don't think that reason plus imagination is sufficient either. I think we need grace. And so I'm going to finish just by reading a prayer, 2 prayers to you that help us, I think, to do this. And they're by 2 of my favorite authors. The first is Marilyn McCord Adams, a philosopher, and Macrina Wiederkehr, who writes a lot about spiritual formation. So let me just read these prayers and then I'm done. Okay, so pray with me. Oh God, the whole idea that who we are and what we do might show others what you are like is mind-boggling. But you are a God who specializes in shaping unlikely materials into advertisements of your power and goodness. Thank you for molding us, clay in your hands. Oh God, help us to believe the truth about ourselves, no matter how beautiful it is. Thank you. Amen.
Robert was very careful to time his talk to leave us plenty of time for questions and answers, and we have a microphone set up here. So I will ensure that everyone can hear your question and that Robert will be able to answer. So please, in the spirit of Socrates, let's have a conversation.
Thanks for the courage of walking up first.
So my question, thinking about what you're saying here, is I see a lot of parallels certainly in the life of Jesus and how he interacted with other people. But the conflicting part of me thinks back to Old Testament stories where God seemed to have a pretty big callousness towards humans. Like Job, for instance, where his family is essentially irreplaceable.
Right.
So what would, did he have any comments about that?
Great. Yeah, thank you for your question. So the question is, in the Old Testament in particular, we have depictions of God that might look like they're in tension with this view, right? Especially the book of Job. You know, Job loses his wife and his children, and at the end of the book, he gets them all back. It looks like they've been replaced. So I'm not an expert on the Old Testament. I've been told by one of my colleagues who is, this is just to note something, that there's actually some controversy about the book of Job precisely because of the ending. Some scholars, from what I've been told, question whether that ending was part of the original story because of the fact that it does seem strange that Job gets replacements, right? So I don't know whether I agree with that. I'm just sort of mentioning it. It's interesting. I do find the book of Job to be an interesting point of reference here. I don't know what Lewis would say about that book. I have not, as far as I know, he doesn't talk about that particular challenge. So my own view would be that whatever is happening there, it's not supposed to suggest that his first wife and children were replaceable in the sense that, I'm talking about. But it's just a restoration of family. Yeah. But you're asking a hard question. I wish I had more to say about it. The other part of your question had to do, I think, with the broader picture in the Old Testament.
There is more. So, I think of the Exodus story. So the 10th plague is killing children.
Right.
And it's hard to say that those are VIP individuals when they seem like pretty, well, not replaceable exactly, but disposable maybe.
Right. Yeah. So what you're raising a very difficult problem. Has to do with, what should we make of the events in the Bible that depict God as committing genocide, or killing children, or ordering the massacres and things like that. There are people. I just want to say that's a hard problem. I don't have on the back of my hand like a ready answer for it. I know that people are working on it. Like Paul Copan, for example, has a couple of books where he talks about these things. So that problem is getting more attention. And I just think there are different options to work through. But I don't think that it's inconsistent with the view of persons and God that I'm laying out. I think it just requires a way to understand what's happening there. I'll say as well, though, even if you don't buy into my picture here, even if you're just a regular theist, you still face the problem of making sense of those texts. If God is all good and all powerful and just, what's going on there? In other words, you don't need a super high view of the value of persons to worry about your problem. So this is a philosopher's way of saying it's not just my problem. And so we hopefully move on. But yeah, I appreciate you asking the question. I hope I'm not sounding dismissive, but I'm not prepared to give a full-blooded answer to it, though people have offered it. Yeah. Thank you. Any other questions? They will all be easier than that last one, I'm sure.
Thank you for coming. My question is about, as you started talking through the way we experience that, I think you had the philosopher's approach to that, and then you had the second one, the third one was grace. It seemed to me that there was two in my head or in heart that are missing from that, which is the Holy Spirit and then experience. And so can you speak to that just a little bit about how we can feel and believe what you're sharing outside of just the three ways that you talked?
Yeah, thank you. So you mentioned two things, experience and the Holy Spirit. I was trying to at least suggest that with respect to the Holy Spirit by saying that we need to pray. Like that to accept the beautiful truth about ourselves, like we need to overcome ourselves, and that takes grace and the Holy Spirit. When it comes to experience, one thing that I think is important is that, and this is part of how Lewis thinks about this view, is that the uniqueness of a person is not something you can just see, like in just a brief encounter. But that love is something that discloses the uniqueness of the beloved. Right? So it's the experience of love, self-sacrificial love, various kinds of loves, that it's in that kind of context that we actually come into a vivid kind of experience with the uniqueness of a person. Yeah, and I think that's, it works the other way as well. I think that loving somebody helps them see that about themselves as well. So I do think that love as a self-sacrificial action towards others is crucial for coming to see and experience. And maybe like what you're suggesting, and I appreciate this, like when it comes to taking this idea to heart, right? We need to experience it, and that requires living in this kind of way. Is that?
The way of formation.
The way of formation, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, thank you. Please.
So you sort of described this dual nature, this dual human nature, dual notion of human nature, where there's one aspect where there's all the qualities that all humans have sort of in common, and then there's this sort of my own aspect, where I am uniquely, can be uniquely an image of God. However, and I know that there's debate about sort of God's love being infinite, and that he can love differently in an infinite amount of ways. But it seems that the unique maker, really, on that side, on my own side, is the same thing every time, where it's God's love. So it's not actually, me, it's this capacity that we all have. And so then it would be the least specific. And then if we try to bring the specificity back, then it's the properties, the accidental properties that you listed earlier, where it's, my history, my experiences and stuff. And that's where I am this unique image. But then, so if all images of Aslan, then what about the wicked? And are the wicked equal to the righteous if we're all supremely valuable?
Let me see if I follow the first part of your question. So it has to do with this dual nature thing.
Yeah.
So there's a common playful kind of objection. Well, if everybody's unique, then nobody's unique, right? And I feel like you're in the ballpark of that kind of objection. Let me just sort of tell you in a little more detail what Lewis has in mind, and tell me if this resolves it. So let's work with a metaphor. So think of musical instruments. A musical instrument is a capacity. It could be sitting there, or it could be being played, right? And so on Lewis's account, it's akin to saying that each person is a different musical instrument. That instrument is like your unique nature. So you have your shared nature, and you have this unique capacity, and it's like an instrument. right? So it's true that you and I both have a unique nature, and if that's all you could say, then there's nothing unique. But what you really need to say is, no, you have this unique qualitative capacity that only you have, like being the unique instrument. Does that clarify things to help you?
So that would clarify, my concern would be that it is sort of determining this equality amongst the instruments and also the possibility of an instrument being out of tune, not operating with its capacity to be an image, and not operating as it should.
Right.
I'd say that's as good as the other instruments.
Gotcha, yeah.
It's neither too much more.
So this is the second part of your question about what about the wicked or the, yes, okay, so the view here is that, everybody is like an instrument, to go with the metaphor. Everybody has a unique capacity to image God in a way they only can. But notice I'm stressing it's a capacity, right? And like any capacity, it could be failed to be engaged. And it can atrophy, right? So, you can beat up that instrument. You can put a big cork in it, right? So a fallen person has the capacity, but it's just inoperative, right? So to be fallen or to be wicked or to be sinful is, you have that capacity. It's just that you're not engaging it, you're not using it. And you might even be developing a character that makes it more and more difficult to. Even the damned still have this capacity. It's just that it's severely sort of atrophied, right? I'm just trying to tell you what Lewis would say, and I think I agree with this too, yeah.
Really?
Yeah, I do.
No, thank you.
Any other, okay, yeah, thank you.
No.
Hi, welcome.
I really appreciate your talk.
Thank you.
I'm just absolutely amazed that C.S. Lewis wrote for so many years, over 20,000 letters, and I'm wondering what those letters tell us about him. He must have good days and bad days. What kind of style, whether there's humor or pathos, or what exactly are the letters like?
Yeah, thank you. The great question. I've read all of his letters that have been published, and they are everything you just said. Some of them are perfunctory business letters. Some of them are profound little essays that are publishable, and then I use them when I teach. I'm like, students, you need to read. He gives instructions. For example, some student asked him, what are some ways I can improve my writing? And he gives this letter to Joan McAllister, I forget, like 6 tips on writing, right? And they're great, tips on writing. But in other letters, he talks about philosophical and theological problems. And some of his letters, they're very personal, sharing his struggles, for example. So he has a bunch of letters to a woman, Sister Penelope, who was a nun who wrote a bunch of things. She translated St. Athanasius's On the Incarnation. Lewis wrote the preface, which is now published as On the Reading of Old Books. And she and Lewis had this back and forth correspondence. And one thing that's interesting about it is he talks about confession. And he says, I feel like I need to go to confession. I don't want to. I think I need to do this. And then a few months later, he's like, okay, I went. It was really hard. So that's just, I'm just trying to give you just a little bit of an example.
What about humor?
Yeah, there's lots of fun. He's a funny guy. Yeah, I highly recommend his letters. They're just great to read.
Well, thank you again for coming.
You're welcome. Thank you for the question. I appreciate it. Yeah. Hey.
Thank you for asking me.
Yeah.
Okay, I have a question about one of the quotes. I think it's from The Great Divorce. Let me just repeat it.
Here it is.
Good as it ripens becomes continually more different, not only from evil but from other good.
Yeah.
I didn't come to the other talk today.
That's fine.
It seems like
I won't hold it against you.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate it. it seems like C.S. Lewis takes some Platonic ideas too, and makes a sort of Christian Platonism or some sort of synthesis between the two. But I was wondering, especially with this quote, where good becomes different from other good, it seems to rub up against the Platonic idea of the form of the good as singular or one.
Right.
Do you think that these two views, that, I don't know, I wonder if he actually does hold them,
Yeah.
but that those two views are incompatible?
Great, thank you. I appreciate that question. So, his idea seems to be that you become increasingly like God. There's no endpoint, by the way. And so do I, right? So it's a doctrine of theosis or divinization, right? We all participate in the divine nature, but we become more and more like Christ. But you might think on a kind of simplistic way of thinking about that, well, if we're all becoming more and more like Christ, aren't we going to converge and become just a crowd of duplicate little Jesuses, right? Lewis talks about this explicitly in Mere Christianity. He's like, that is not what happens, because each person becomes more and more like God in a way that nobody else does, right? So, you have to sort of think about the infinite array of God's beauty, right? There's an infinite number of ways or aspects of God's goodness and beauty. I know that that's a metaphysically tricky thing to say, but kind of go with it for a moment, right? If there's an infinite number of ways that God is good or beautiful, and each is kind of intensive, right? You resemble one of those ways ever increasingly so, right? And so do I. So there is a, in the Platonic way of thinking, there is the good, which is God, but it's multifaceted, right? And you image one facet of it. And not just image that, but you can do so increasingly. That's what I would... to be fair, this is kind of me trying to think through what Lewis is really saying. Yeah. I don't know anymore where the line is between myself and Lewis on these things, so... Great question, though. Thank you for that. Anyone else?
Hello.
Hi, thank you.
What do people who are not believers, who don't believe in God, what do they take from this? How do they see this?
Well, so what do non-believers, I hear you asking at least two questions. They're great questions. One is, what would a non-believer say about Lewis's view? And what would a non-believer say about VIP, right? There are lots of ways to be a non-believer. There's like your standard atheist, but then there's people who are they don't believe in Christianity or theism, but they hold to some other religious view, right? I won't speak for that. I will say that in the Eastern traditions, it's harder to make sense of the idea that persons have this kind of unique supreme value. But to speak about the kinds of non-believers that I'm most familiar with, like your philosophical atheists and people who think that the natural world is all there is, they try hard to come up with an account of how it is that people have value and dignity. And many of them say it can't be done, and they just say it's just an illusion, it's a myth, it's false. So some non-believers go that route. Other non-believers try and make a case for it. And to be honest, the best case I know of is by an atheist named Eric Wielenberg, who, and I hope I hope I get his view right here. I'm trying to be charitable, but it boils down to the idea that it's just a brute fact about the world, that there's value in the world. We don't explain it, it's just the case, right? And he would say something like, in every view there are things that can't be explained, and this is just mine, right? But that Eric Wielenberg also has a paper where he tries to give an account of what makes individuals intrinsically valuable. And it's pretty deplorable. And he has since said, yeah, it doesn't work. By the way, I had a friend who criticized him, and he said, yeah, okay, it doesn't work. So I don't know what he says now, but what he used to say is something like, well, psychological capacities, right? That's what makes a person have a kind of value, right? But he just admits it doesn't secure equal value. It doesn't, and it means that people have value to different degrees. So I don't know how they're supposed to do it. I think they can offer something like an account, but I don't think they have the resources. I mean, honestly, I'm certain they don't have the resources to offer a very powerful account of why we should think that persons have this unique, irreplaceable, and supreme value. Yeah, I just don't think they can achieve that. Please.
What would Lewis have said anything about non-believers? Or did he have any opinions about that? And what did he say?
I mean, he wrote for non-believers. Like the BBC, like Mere Christianity was written for an audience originally that was mostly people. 2/3 of the original audience of the BBC broadcasts were indifferent or hostile to religion. So that book was originally written for an audience that was only 1/3 sympathetic to what he was saying. So yeah, he was surrounded by non-believers. A woman that lived in his house for 23 years was a non-believer, Mrs. Moore. So yeah, he was not isolated at all from non-believers at all. Yeah, thank you. Anyone else? Or are we out of time? I don't know.
We're almost out of time, but can I follow up on that question just to ask you?
Please.
You quoted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights.
Yeah.
Which has always struck me as very interesting because there were Christians who were involved in the formulation of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But it was meant to, the reason that your question really resonates with me about this point is, of course, the Declaration is intended to be written in such a way that it's non-sectarian, right? That any person, but I see a paradoxical problem here. It's asserted, but no reasons whatsoever are given for thinking it's true.
Right.
Which kind of connects with an argument that you made earlier. So I'm curious what you would say about the fact that we want this to be true. Well, let me see if I can. You probably won't be sympathetic with this formulation, but let me try this. Everyone wants this to be true, or nearly everyone, right? There are misanthropes who hate people, so we'll set them aside for the moment. But nearly everyone wants this to be true. But I think Lewis is essentially making an argument that only theism provides the resources for it to be true. Is that correct? And can you comment on that?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I'm brainstorming. I'm trying to remember whether Lewis says anything about, to the effect of only Christians or only theists can provide a foundation for this. It seems implied in many places that he writes, that there's an implication of something to that effect. But I'm not remembering a direct argument that he gives. Something I would say, though, is it's not just that we want it to be true. One might hear what you said, David, and say, so should we just not think it's true if we don't have a foundation for it, right? And that would be kind of a catastrophic result, right, I think, because we want people to believe this, not only because it's true, but because a lot is at stake. I think there's something to be said here along the lines of, I think we just see it to be true. You know, I think it's just kind of obvious to many of us that this is the case, right? And like many moral facts, I think that we find them to be clearly true, even if either we don't have an account of them or our own convictions kind of go against them, you know. So, and I think it's okay to maintain your belief in this because you just think, oh, that's just obviously the case. I know individuals, and they seem to me to have this kind of profound value. I think that is how people present themselves in certain contexts. I think we do see that. And I don't think we should give it up just because we don't have an account. Yeah. Thank you for that.
Professor Garcia, thank you.
You're welcome. Thanks.
On this question about the UN Universal Declaration, I'm tempted to mention Jacques Maritain, who's one of the architects of the Declaration, and who has a principle of practical convergence. So he tries to envision that it's possible that different parties could converge on the same conclusions, well and good. But then it just occurred to me, this is a talk about C.S. Lewis, and I was wondering if we could take a book like The Abolition of Man to think of what the consequences would be if VIP were not true.
I see.
And that seems to me to be a very prophetic book, because I think we live in a world of the abolition of man, just the way that Lewis presents it in that book.
Right.
So I was just wondering what you thought about that as a way of, how Lewis might, because he's also a critic of prevailing secular society.
Right.
And, the institutions and so forth that we could address for the rest of the evening. But it's kind of like, it reminds me a little bit of Pope Francis's critique of the technocratic paradigm.
Okay.
Like if we wanted to study that, we might read The Abolition of Man as a casebook for making the argument about what's wrong with this way of thinking about our own humanity.
Right.
So what do you think about that?
Yeah, I do agree that, for example, that The Abolition of Man is, in a certain sense, kind of extremely timely right now. Yeah. I like this principle of convergence from Maritain as well. And I think like in Lewis's concept of mere Christianity, for example, that he has something similar going on. That like, there are lots of different denominations, for example, but we have a convergence, what he calls mere Christianity, this core, this beautiful, solid, robust truth, that we don't agree on everything, but we agree on sort of the Nicene Creed, something like that. I think that's very important to celebrate, to affirm. When it comes to...
If we deny the thesis, we live in this kind of rotten world that we presently experience.
Yeah.
If I may be
Sure. Sure, no, it's fine. I think that one thing I'm interested in is to just raise this question of, okay, how do we account for VIP, or the way that we often think of ourselves? Is it just wishful thinking or self-flattery, or do we have a reason to think it's true? And if we're left kind of with nothing to say to support it, I think that's a very bad result. I think we're going to end up with a culture where people just say, well, it's a nice thing to say, but why think it's the case? Just kind of, it's a convenient thing to say without a ground, without a motive. And I think the most devastating result of that is not the result that people will deny it, but rather the result that people won't be compelled by it. It'll just be something we say, but not something we actually are in the grip of in the way we treat other people. And that's what when I was talking about the role of beyond argument, the role of narrative and the imagination and prayer. I think that's what's required to sort of take this idea and not just give a philosophical basis for it, but to get it into the way you treat other people and the way you think of yourself. I think those are crucial things. So, yeah, thank you for your question. I appreciate that.
I think we're out of time. Let's thank our speaker.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thanks again for coming. If you want information about the Faith and Reason Institute, please Just do a Google search, Gonzaga Faith and Reason, and if you want to stay apprised of events, we have a set of talks about film and faith in about a month, and Father Spitzer's coming in the spring and February. So if you want to be on our mailing list, please sign up. Thanks. Good night.